Thank you very much. After that, anything that I can do can only be an anticlimax. But at any rate, let me have a go. Liberalism is a big topic. I have in effect given 2 or 3 university courses about it. In fact, if we padlocked the doors and brought in the portaloos, maybe I could try and cram as much in as possible during the rest of the day. But actually there are 1 or 2 other rather distinguished speaker sessions. What I'm going to do rather is to talk for a bit under 30 minutes. And my concern is going to be with some of the very basic ideas and how they relate to politics in Australia today. I'm going to explain some key ideas. I'll say a tiny little bit about how they've been interpreted politically, and then I'll turn briefly at the end to how they relate to politics in Australia today. All of which, at least in my view, adds up to a reasonably interesting story. I will try to be brief so there'll be time for you to ask questions about anything that you like, and in particular a reference was made to Friedrich Hayek. He's someone on whom I've done a lot of work. If there is anything relating to him or other key people in recent history of liberalism, I'm not going to be talking about them particularly in what I say now, but do feel free to ask me questions about them later. Let me start off with some very basic ideas. If you look at things historically, one easy way into liberalism is to see it as a product of British history. There, one key ingredient developed right back in the 17th century. One had resistance to the absolutist tendencies, the wish really just to take over additional power on the part of some British kings, and people resisting them invoked ideas about individual rights. In part, their ideas about this were drawn from traditional legal and sort of customary constitutional ideas, but in part they were also drawn from the idea that we had various duties to God which we needed to have rights in order to be able to fulfill. And in this context, 2 things are particularly important. On one side, there was this notion of people as having various kind of rights. On the other, that these were rights which didn't fundamentally derive from the government, which could be asserted against the government. One had, in terms of the substance of this, ideas about a right to liberty, a right to one's bodily integrity, not to be beaten up, but also to security in one's property. And related to this, there was the claim that if the government didn't respect such rights, one was in principle entitled to rebel and to institute a new government which would respect them. There were also ideas about the importance of government by consent, and the idea that government should be governing in the interests of its citizens. And one finds, for example, these sorts of ideas in John Locke's 2 treatises of government, and similar ideas were influential on the American Revolution in the 18th century. If you look at these documents, the ideas in terms of which they're couched are often old-fashioned. I mean, few people are going to start their political argument by saying, well, look, let me bring in the Reverend so-and-so who will convince you of the existence of God, after which we'll go on to issues about individual rights. But there's a lot about the substance of these approaches which still resonates with us today. Now, the target of these ideas in the 17th and 18th century was typically kings and the aristocracy. But from the 19th century onwards, governments increasingly became democratic. But one finds then much the same ideas being reaffirmed in the 19th century by writers such as John Stuart Mill. And they were arguing against what Mill, following the French writer Tocqueville, called the tyranny of the majority. That's to say, these ideas which had initially been set out as ways of resisting grabs for power on the part of kings and the people associated with them in government, were then invoked against democratic majorities who might equally not properly respect people's rights. And indeed, Mill tried to base his ideas not on notions drawn from God, but on the ideas of utilitarianism, ideas about what would make for the greatest happiness of the greatest number of people. Other, more recent writers have also talked about the ways in which you might support notions of individual rights in other kinds of ways. And Mill also affirmed the right to freedom of expression. Now, all of this stuff may be familiar, but you might surely say the following. Look, this stress on rights is all very well, but what about society? I mean, if you emphasize to this extent the significance of individual rights, what makes for social well-being? And it's here, really, that it seems to me, if one's talking about the kind of big picture for liberalism, that a second key component comes in. And it's something which is neatly summed up in an aspect of the writings of the 18th century economist Adam Smith. What do I have in mind? Well, one of the key things in Smith's Wealth of Nations was his account of the division of labour. Let's start with a workshop. Say, as Smith did, with one in which people were making pins. If people set about to make an entire pin themselves from the most basic ingredients, their output would be tiny. But if the task were broken down into small components, so that people specialized in different things, there could then be a huge increase in output. However, for this to be productive, the tasks would need to be coordinated. I mean, for example, if you guys on this side were making pinheads, and the rest of you at the back were doing the shafts of the pins, and you guys perhaps were responsible for putting them together. Well, if you people really went to town on pinheads, I mean, in the end, the result wouldn't be productive. We would just get a surplus of pinheads, and we'd be kind of wading through the bloody things before the end of the day. So you needed, in this context, to get the task to be coordinated with one another. And in a workshop or factory, this would be arranged by the owner or manager or board of the cooperative or whatever else it might be. But, and this is what's crucial, the same division of labour operates in society more generally. But there, and this is really Smith's key insight, we don't need the equivalent of a manager to allocate the tasks. Rather, you get this notion that you can, for the most part, depend on prices and economic self-interest. Essentially, there is the notion that prices, as we receive them in the economy, give us incentives to respond to the kind of things that others would like. I mean, suppose it had been the case, actually it wasn't, it's a bit of a shame, but suppose it had been the case, I have been told by the organisers of this, we will pay you a fee of $500 to come here. Okay? I come here and I'm asked to do this. It might have been the case that if someone simply said, you have $500 to come and do your thing in Parramatta, I would say, this is what I've always wanted. I would go outside and come back in Lurex and do a vigorous 5 or 10 minutes of go-go dancing, possibly in a cage. Now, clearly, or alas, I would say, it is not at all obvious, or at least other than on a tiny one-off, that anyone would give me any money to do that. But you have the notion, rather, okay, yeah, I mean, don't keep thinking about it. It might be sort of off-putting. But the plot basically is that within a market economy, if it's functioning okay, we are given an incentive to put our actions to the uses and our stuff to the uses which best fit in with demands expressed by other people, and with the notion that we in effect are given the sorts of cash incentives to draw us into what amounts to cooperating with other people. And this isn't the only rationale for it, but this is one of the rationales for liberals favouring free trade, because you can see this as, in principle, just extending the range of people who may be productively engaged in this kind of division of labour. Another key thing, I had said I wasn't going to talk about free to hire, but one tiny tweak to this argument is the following: that not only in such a market economy are people able to respond to financial incentives, but they are able to make use of their own knowledge and ideas, and including things that they could act on but aren't able to articulate. And you can see in this respect this kind of mechanism as serving really to enable all kinds of knowledge and insights and so on to be put into productive use in the economy. But equally, someone may have a really great idea, or at least so they think, and no one else is interested. But the key thing again in a market economy is, if the idea is no good, it will die off quickly, releasing the entrepreneur to do something else. And one of the key things, if you look at the autobiographies of entrepreneurs, is that they regularly stuff up, but they learn that the ideas don't work. Contrast this with politics, where basically we are typically living with all of the bad ideas, and where it isn't just the politician's fault, because if anyone makes a mistake, no one will let them forget it, so they typically never admit to having got things wrong. But the result of that is that we just live on with a lot of bad ideas. Now, what's involved in this stuff about the division of labour is strikingly illustrated by a popular writer from the 20th century, a guy called Leonard Reed. And I don't know if you've come across it, but he wrote a short piece called I, Pencil, in which, and I don't have one to hand, but imagine this was a lead pencil. What he argued was that if you take something like a lead pencil, no one knows everything that's involved in making it. His point was this: the lead pencil involves wood, graphite down the middle, paint on the outside, rubber, and a bit of metal to hold it in. All kinds of different people all over the world are involved in making this. One could illustrate it even more graphically now with a portable, a laptop or a tablet. I mean, sometimes greenies will go on about, you know, the vast number of people all over the world who are involved in this. I think that's something to celebrate. For them, it's a kind of tragedy. But the key thing here is that even something relatively simple like the pencil depends on countless other people performing various tasks. And what's more, all of them depend on other people. The wood depends on chainsaws, the producers of petrol, the producers of oil for chainsaws. If it's anything like me, people with skill to help you get the chain back on the chainsaw after it's dropped off, and various things like this. And each of these things in turn depends on the behaviour of countless further people. And all told, if you think of this and think of it kind of going back, you have a myriad of people performing different tasks, none of whom will typically know that, in fact, one aspect of their activities will end up in the production of pencils. And so what you're dealing with here is coordination of activities of firms and of individuals in this way, by way of prices, of a kind which brings us then the sorts of things that we have, but which also the economists Ludwig von Mises and Friedrich Hayek argued can't actually be replicated in other ways. That the idea somehow that you could have the benefits of societies like ours while basically getting rid of markets, they argued, I think pretty persuasively, that you just can't do it. Now, for all of this to work, one needs a system of law and its enforcement in the background. Much of the activity is governed by contracts, but these need to be available in appropriate forms. I mean, if you have a legal system that just doesn't have the law of contract of an appropriate kind or commercial law, then things won't work. In a similar kind of way, one needs to have ways in which contracts are enforced, in which bankruptcies are dealt with and so on, but in ways that serve to foster economic activity rather than to stuff it up. In addition, and more basically, one needs to have property protected so that people pursue their interests by trading rather than by robbing one another, and providing this in societies like Australia is a key role of government along with the provision of defence. We also in Australia typically expect government to do a lot more, and most but not all liberal economists think that government has some role in the management of the economy. And also one can add to it, although these things may be contested, in the provision of infrastructure, possibly of education, in the regulation of economic and social activity. Although there is a lively controversy as to just what and how much of this is needed, and another possible issue on the agenda is welfare. Now you might say, and some people here might object to the notion, that welfare should be a concern of government. How did it become a concern of government? Well, there are a couple of, I think, quite good reasons why it got in, and there was something which I think is a bit more problematic. On the one side, the development of a market economy means that people move around, and older welfare structures like extended families can't bear the cost, say, of looking after the elderly in quite so well as they used to in the past. I mean, I don't know how many people here have families who come from overseas. I mean, certainly I'm one. If you say, well, it really is your extended family's concern to look after you, well, extended family where? How are they going to do it? You might say, well, what you have to do is to form mutual benefit societies and so on. I think actually, not only were these important historically, but they were also very good, but they hit some problems. And one of them is really the problem that they didn't anticipate correctly how long people might start to live. And so where they had pension schemes, they typically hit the problem that they just started to run out of money. And obviously there is a difficult problem at the moment, just on the grounds that lots of Australians would like still to retire at 55. There is a risk that people will live on and on and on, and particularly then to points when they're going to need a fair bit of looking after. And this at the very least gets onto the plate of government, the agenda, what are we going to do about this? I'm not saying it should necessarily be in the business of paying, but there is a sense in which this is going to be something which gets a bit beyond just a private problem, not least because it's difficult to forecast for the individual what your life expectancy is going to be. On the other side, some liberals took the view that liberal concerns for the individual, liberal ideas that individuals matter, implied that somehow we owed to everyone what's needed for the self-development and participation of individuals. As electors, as citizens, as well-rounded people and so on. And by this means we got what started to look like open-ended welfare commitments to everyone. Now, all of this leads to some big issues. First, how does one get government to do what liberals need it to do without, first of all, stuffing up the various key economic mechanisms, and second, just becoming a vehicle for special interests? And second, if government is involved in welfare, how do you avoid our becoming overburdened and with the demands of worthy causes and also of causes which aren't worthy. For example, self-funded retirees who qualify for partial pensions but who actually can be pretty wealthy. I mean, my suspicion is that if I had had financial advice of a better quality, I might have qualified for close to a full pension. And this isn't because I'd be particularly poor, it's because essentially people engaged in wealth management stuff, or in my case, limited wealth management, find ways in which they can kind of launder things in such a way that you don't undermine an entitlement to a pension. The problem is that such people have political clout, and so it's interesting at the moment when the government has been trying to address issues about how do we cut back. There's great emphasis on we're not going to do anything about the elderly. Well, some of the elderly really need a lot of help. There are a bunch of people who certainly don't, but they are, as it were, politically off limits to touch. All sorts of things can present themselves as morally worthy, and one of the big issues here, which is worth bearing in mind, are the ideas associated with so-called public choice analysis. The key notion that they introduced was you mustn't think of government as being something like a benevolent despot, an all-powerful figure who, if there are problems in society or markets don't work perfectly, can be entrusted with power and they will fix it. The reality of it is that everyone involved in politics are pursuing various kinds of interests. So, for example, as an election comes up, politicians, even the staunchest of liberal politicians, will be seen going around marginal constituencies throwing money around. Okay? In a similar kind of way, people working for worthy charities, people of various kinds of public concerns will be out there trying to get more money for their cause. And the result of this is that, what government does is broadly set by compromises between these interests, rather than government actually doing what the best thing is. Now, liberalism, in the senses that I've described, plays a key role in Australian politics. But they are not the only things that play such a role. Conservatism is also important. And to cut a long story short, there are three strands to this. First of all, there might be personal conservatism in people's values. And this is perfectly compatible with liberalism. That's to say, liberals may at a personal level be libertine, or they may be puritanical. And if it just concerns their own conduct, no big deal. A second kind of problem is that there may be a concern for valuable traditions and institutions which can sometimes pose a genuine, interesting and difficult problem for liberalism. Namely, there may be things which are characteristic of Australian life which we really like, but where we find that these things sort of start to get a bit undermined because of certain kinds of economic change. Or might see, for example, the bush fire brigades as being something which you could do pretty well when you had a good number of people working on the land. It becomes rather more difficult as the number of people who are in these sorts of occupations gets smaller, or they're doing things from which they can't as easily be released. There is, though, another aspect to conservatism, and it's found generally in conservative politics mixed with liberalism, namely a wish basically to impose one's own values on others, something that seems to me to be in tension with liberalism, but which is often combined with it in electoral politics. One can think here of Mrs. Thatcher, John Howard, and Tony Abbott. Consider, for example, debates about such things as the soft drugs or gay marriage, where to the degree to which people are inspired by sort of strictly liberal agendas, they're likely to be sort of pretty open to this, but where electorally these things are kind of tough, or because we do have a few older people in the audience, I possibly should say, well then what about hard drugs and voluntary euthanasia? I mean, that may be, as time goes on and we have more and more aches and pains, this starts to become more important. Well, now I guess what I'm saying is, this is something which is typically a feature of conservative parties and liberal parties, but also, I would say, typically of think tanks in Australia as well. That's to say, it seems to me that the Centre for Independent Studies and the IPA are in many ways give us a kind of mix of these things. I referred earlier to senses of liberalism. And in Australia, there's a clear contrast between classical and welfare liberalism. Classical liberals uphold individual rights, but not, in general, interpreted as entitlements to draw on the stuff of other people. They stress a market economy and are leery about too much government activity. They are simply aware of the dangers of this, aware of the ways in which the powers of government can get kidnapped for various other sorts of agendas. And as a result, they tend to favour privatisation, deregulation, private provision of infrastructure, and in general, getting things done not by government, but in the private sector, not least for reasons that go back to the points that I was making before. Namely that in the private sector one can have effective learning that something isn't any good, whereas government isn't too good at this. Welfare liberals may stress individual rights, but interpret them also in terms of entitlements. The result of all this is that Australian politics is dominated by forms of liberalism. I'd say possibly with the exception of Clive Palmer, but I mean, I think he's... I've got to go. The Liberal Party mixes classical liberalism and conservatism, although it's interesting, if you go back to the founder of the modern Liberal Party, Robert Menzies, there was a fair bit of welfare liberalism mixed into his ideas. The Labour Party mixes welfare liberalism and conservatism, while not being as hostile as it used to be to classical liberalism, but where typically, and I hardly need for this audience to go on about this, what characterises the Labour Party is that they typically don't see any danger about asking government to do things and expanding government to get into all sorts of worthy things, just in a certain sense not paying attention to the effects of this on the economy and incentives, but also not paying attention to the degree to which what we may end up doing is spending money on all kinds of things that are basically being kidnapped into various good-sounding causes, but which actually wouldn't really be on anyone's agenda. The Greens tend to stress individual rights and welfare entitlements. As to pure classical liberalism, in my judgment, this is probably best represented by the LDP. But at that point, I should probably stop before I get ejected from a meeting which is, after all, half sponsored by the Liberals.
You're safe in this room.
Thank you very much. Questions? Objections? Anything? Nothing? Well, I should tell my students that rather than giving them a couple of courses, less than 30 minutes here, said everything. Nothing at all. Yeah?
I'll ask one. I'm interested, you mentioned very briefly public choice theory.
Yeah.
I'm interested in how you think public choice theory applies, say, in the area of climate change.
Okay. What I'd say is this. Public choice theory is a kind of big body of stuff. Public choice theories tend to treat everyone, all political actors, as if basically in some sense they're self-interested or have got sort of a very limited agenda rather than a concern for the public interest. I think with regard to climate change, the situation is relatively straightforward. Clearly, there is room for argument about what is going on with regard to climate change. It certainly is the case that if people have got interest in selling us solar panels or whatever else it is, they have got a big interest in kind of beating up on the issue. It also seems to me more generally that in that particular neck of the woods, one of the biggest problems is that notions of renewable energy have got a good name for themselves. They have been subsidized, but in situations where people typically don't look very hard at what the real cost of these things is, and indeed what the costs of actually producing the stuff is, but where at another kind of level, one of the big problems we've hit in Australia at the moment is that people often are encouraged, given financial incentives, to effectively produce their own electricity, but in a setting where other aspects of policy have encouraged people to put in huge electricity grids. The overall result of which then is that we have a system for the grid which is kind of horribly dysfunctional, and where people find electricity expensive. As I live in a rural area, and it's just horrendous. So you tend then to say, let's opt out of that, which then pushes the... So, I mean, we've got kind of oddities being pursued by people who kind of look as if they're doing something worthy, or perhaps are. On the other side of it, I think the big problem with regard to climate change is really this, that you're dealing in this area, if the climate change threat is indeed real, with problems being generated where the effects are pretty remote from those of us who are doing things which are causally responsible for bringing the things about, where also there are enormous difficulties even within a single country like Australia in matching up sort of costs and benefits of things. If you're trying to do this on an international scale, and particularly in a situation where some countries are relatively poor but trying to improve their situation, the political problems are really very, very tough. At the same time, it seems to me that it's an area in which it's very easy for politicians to essentially appeal to the hip pockets of electors, really say, I mean, I'm not in this area a particular fan of the present government's approach. It seems to me if you are going to do something, then basically what is needed is an effective market-based system of pricing. It seems to me policy lunacy to say, no, we're going to do things by way of direct action, using the whims of politicians and the ideas of public servants as the way in which one should go, and where it looks to me as if in this case you have got what could be a very real problem, but where for the kind of reasons that public choice theory serves to highlight, it becomes almost impossible to get effective policy to address it. I don't know if that's what the kind of thing you were after, but yes, sir.
You mentioned earlier the evolution of libertarianism, which means it's a growing thing. It's a changing thing. I've noticed in my lifetime, I'm not that young, but I'm not old, but I'm not that young, that way back in the 50s and 60s, we proudly stated what we believed. We are a Judeo-Christian country, we had certain values of this, that and the other thing, and we would openly and proudly state them. Now, it's embarrassing to state what you believe. You just become a target, and politics is all about sectional interest clawing for advantage. We've lost the cultural ability of saying, this is what we believe, this is what we stand for, put the ideas out to be tested. And once we state what we believe, then the consequences of political action or government action evolve from that.
Well, I'm pretty sympathetic to what you're saying, but not fully so. I'm sympathetic to the notion that we have got, certainly at the moment, problems about a lack of accountability for what is actually going to form government policy. I mean, it seems to me that one of the bad features of privatization has typically been that companies then claim that their dealings with government are commercial in confidence, so stuff can't be put in the public sphere. It seems to me basically that everything possible should be put into the public sphere and open to scrutiny. If people are lobbying, it should be on the record. I personally, but here again, there's a whisper I may be injected, think that Snowden was a hero, and that if there are claims that there is stuff which it would serve the interests of Australia's enemies if it was made public, then we urgently need to set up a body of people who don't have an automatic government majority amongst them, but who have high level security clearance, who get the chance to scrutinize everything that's going on. It seems to me to be an absurdity to think that the military and the security services can be effectively policed by themselves. I mean, it's a little bit like having a system in which essentially the case for the prosecution put together between the police and the prosecution then is allowed to go unchallenged. I mean, it just seems to me to be a kind of madness. I think 7/11 was a real tragedy, but particularly a tragedy for liberty. And I find one of the horrors in Australia at the moment, but more generally across the world, is an unwillingness of people to stand up and say, look, we simply can't trust government. This doesn't mean that people are wicked. It's likely to be the case that in whatever we're doing, we may make mistakes or oversights, and if there isn't decent scrutiny of what's going on, the consequences can be really bad. I've been vigorously indicated that I should now shut up. There are going to be some opportunities for discussion in the intervals, and I'm very happy to talk further with people then. So thank you all very much.